is EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavita Cardoza. I'm so excited to welcome Katherine Kokal, a journalist with the Palm Beach Post who covered the Florida High School Athletics Association annual pre-participation physical form. That's the official, super boring name of the form at the center of this super fascinating story. Kati, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
You broke the story that when athletes in Florida register for the season, in addition to reporting information to schools on medical conditions like broken bones, seizures, and allergies, there are questions marked for female athletes only. They have to provide information on their history of menstrual periods. So when they got their first period, how many weeks passed between periods, when they had their last one, and two others, right?
Yes, the other two were how many periods have you had in the last year and what the longest time between periods was in the last year.
So this wasn't a new rule or requirement, right? So how did you find out about this?
That's correct. So this story, like many, started with a really great tip. A parent of a Palm Beach County school district athlete reached out to me, and she was concerned. Her athlete doesn't get a period, so this wasn't really even something that impacted her family. But she reached out and sent me a photo of the online form that Palm Beach County schools were using to register athletes. And this was new because in the past, athletes would fill out this form on paper and they'd hand it over to the coach, and the coach would hand it over to the athletic director. But in this last year, Palm Beach County decided to take all of that online so they could easily track and store these forms. So that really raised alarm bells for this parent, because as she was filling out this form, she's thinking, if I had a child who had a menstrual period, I have to fill out this information on this online form, and I don't really know where it goes. So she just sent it to me and said, I'd love it if you could look into this. This doesn't really impact me and my family, but it feels weird. In a post-Roe v. Wade world, it feels weird. And that was kind of what set off this entire process.
So the online data storage was new, and we know from several examples like all over the country about how that information can be hacked or misused. You wrote, concerns have been heightened both by a shifting political landscape criminalizing abortions and scrutinizing transgender athletes, and the growing threat to medical privacy in the digital age. Can you set the social and political context for us, Kati? How did you recognize this as a big story?
Mm-hmm. Well, this tip came to me in August, and so it had been about 2 months since the Dobbs versus Jackson women health decision that effectively overturned Roe v. Wade in this country. And I had been reading stories and talking to people about, how they were a little bit more careful about their reproductive privacy. There was kind of a movement over the summer for people to stop using online period tracking apps because they didn't want that information to be stored in the cloud. They didn't want it to potentially be owned by a company. And so it was kind of within that context that I got this email. And I think especially young people, specifically people who are using TikTok, we're seeing a lot of messages about we're in a different era now, post-Roe. No matter where you live, there were a lot of people talking about wanting to be a little bit more private about their personal medical data. And that was a concern that echoed through the tip that I got.
So my initial reaction when I read your first story was, why on earth would anyone want this information? Like pediatricians, coaches, there are valid reasons. So tell me what you found.
Absolutely. There were 3 questions that really came from that first tip. And this is what my editor and I talked about. These are the questions we wanted to answer to begin with. Where does the information go? So when Palm Beach County athletes and athletes across Florida submit this information, where does it go? How can it be shared or kept private? That was question number 1. Question 2 was, why are these questions asked? And question 3 was, who is asking these questions and how long have they been asking these questions? And actually, one of the first conversations I had about this story after my editor and I and the tipster and I, was with my mother, who's an OBGYN practicing in Wisconsin, because I called her and I said, when you're, talking to young athletes, do you talk about this with them? Is this something that, why would an athletic association want to know this information? And she actually said, she's put it pretty simply, and this was echoed throughout my reporting when I talked to other pediatricians, is that knowing a young person's menstrual irregularities is really important, because as people go through puberty, when they start to get their period, delays in periods or really heavy periods can be indicators of something else going on. So what I learned from doctors is that it's really, really normal for young people to be talking about their menstrual cycles with their doctors. What they then told me was that it's really unnecessary for schools to have this information. And so the pre-participation physical form is this annual physical evaluation form. And there's over 50 questions on it. It asks athletes, have you ever broken a bone? Do you have, trouble breathing? Those are questions that are really important because they can signal, stress fractures, or they can signal, heart issues. But the form is used in a physician's office where the physician goes through all the questions, and then they sign off on whether the athlete is okay to play. And that is really important because you don't want, 300,000 student athletes in Florida to be taking the field without, knowing what their histories are, and knowing that a doctor has signed them off to play. Now, the difference then was the physicians and the pediatricians and the OBGYNs I talked to said, these are really important questions to ask an athlete to understand whether they're having female athlete triad issues, whether they've got bone density issues that could lead to fractures or breaks. But it doesn't really need to go to schools. Whether you are having irregular periods really doesn't impact your ability to play if a doctor has signed off saying that you are cleared to play. So the questions were coming from this physical form. That physical form is put together by physicians, and they agree that these are important questions to ask. But throughout this reporting process, we learned that they didn't really feel like it was necessary to then fill out the entire medical history form and turn it into someone's school and their coach.
So essentially, there are two forms, one with detailed medical, or there could be two forms where there's detailed medical history, which the doctor has, and then the sign off, which goes to the school.
Yes, that's correct. There are these two parts of the form, the medical history and then the doctor sign off.
Okay. So I have to say, Katie, I love, just to go to kind of the reporting process for a second, I love how you add details to the story. Like, one sentence was, the board comprised of 14 men and 2 women. And another, this is when talking about the executive director of the Florida High School Athletics Association, who basically gave false information at a meeting. You wrote, after signing on about 40 minutes late to the meeting, Damon said he had recently spoke to the athletic association, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. I just love the example of show, don't tell. And I felt like that elevated, a simple newspaper story to something with characters and, you got a flavor of the meeting. It was great. Do you purposely try and do that?
I was a government reporter before I started covering education. So I've spent a lot of time in city council meetings, court hearings, things like that. And I try to report with all of my senses the best that I can. Obviously, no one cares what it smelled like in the FHSAA board meeting. But these are things that I notice because what really stuck out to me throughout this reporting process is that the FHSAA board was not a board that was used to public scrutiny. I mean, when I looked at their FOIA logs, the things that people were sending records requests for were like brackets and statistics and, like what were the dates of the last 5 volleyball tournaments as an example. And so they were not necessarily used to having public scrutiny from a reporter who will drive across the state to go to their board meeting because they won't stream it on Zoom. And so those details were important to me. As a woman, I was watching this meeting where they were debating how women's menstrual history and how people's menstrual histories should be recorded. And 2 people on the screen were women. And they made that known too. Those 2 women made it known too. And so I think it's important to kind of broaden your view when we as reporters are places, because I was taking up space in that meeting, and I was there and I noticed things. And like, I noticed when Craig Damon showed up 40 minutes late to the meeting and then presented information that was false. That was important for us to show readers because he wasn't necessarily an authority on this, like his job title may have suggested he would be. That's just kind of part of my reporting process. And I'm glad that those details made it in the story.
I totally agree. Sometimes those little details are exactly what gets cut for space.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was so great. So I actually wanted to shout out your editor if you want to name them.
Oh yes, Holly Botts is my editor at the Palm Beach Post, and she was the driving force behind this. Remember that this was happening in Florida in the first 6 weeks of school. Like I got this tip about this 3 days before the first day of school, and Holly knew from the second we got the tip that this was a story that we needed to cover and that this is one that we were going to prioritize. She pushed me in ways that when I didn't think that this particular route was, as important. And we had so many discussions that were helpful to kind of understand what this story should be. And
Mhm.
she knew from the minute that we started that this was going to be a priority. And
That's
all of it
great.
was going down at the beginning of the school year, which was very busy.
Well, shout out to Holly. And I think from now on, I'm going to ask all the reporters I interview on EWA Radio to shout out their editors. I
Oh,
had not thought
yes.
of it before. But yes, when you have a great editor, it is huge and they deserve recognition.
Oh, gosh. It makes the story, right? I mean,
Absolutely. Absolutely. For all we grumble about editors, yes. So, Katie, to go back to the group, and from what you said, they weren't used to public scrutiny. I mean, it totally showed in your reporting. They did not make it easy for you. They criticized you, they singled you out at a meeting. Tell us a little bit about the ways they tried to intimidate you.
The FHSAA Board of Directors meetings were virtual during the pandemic. They meet in Gainesville. I'm in West Palm Beach. That's about 4 hours from here. It's in the middle of the state. It's where the University of Florida is. So all of these meetings were being conducted virtually during the pandemic. But when I went to go to the board meeting in November, I emailed and asked, can I get a Zoom link for this? The meetings were back to being in person, but they obviously had the infrastructure to do the virtual meetings. And someone ended up attending some of the meetings via Zoom or giving kind of testimony via Zoom. And they said that that wasn't available. So that was like, okay, I have to be at this meeting. We have to be there. These meetings are set on Sundays and Mondays, like there are these 2-day meetings. And this is another place where having an editor in your corner who values this work is so important, because my editor and the editors above her could have easily said, no, we're not going to send a reporter 275 miles away for a meeting over 2 days, put her up in a hotel.
Mm-hmm.
But we did. And it was important because I was the only person there. So they didn't make these meetings, the board meetings, available via Zoom, even though I think that they could have. And then when I got to the meeting, I was kind of shuffled into this little corridor on the side of this board meeting. I was the only non-board member or non-staff member or non-athletic director who was there, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
And at the beginning of the meeting, they had this moment where, they ask members of the public to kind of raise their hand or introduce themselves. And I wasn't going to, I'm just media. I've got a badge on. I wasn't going to introduce myself. And then one of the board members was like, if you'll stand up, please, and introduce yourself. And so now I'm standing in front of this room. I have repeatedly emailed every member of the board for them to comment on this, to talk to me about it. All of them have denied me. And I just have to kind of clear my throat and proudly say, I'm Katherine Kokal. I'm the education reporter with the Palm Beach Post. And little did I know that moments before that and after that, they had circulated a 4-page memo with my name on it, talking about how I didn't have a medical degree, talking about how I have no medical expertise, and kind of trying to poke holes in the original investigation that we published about the menstrual question. So was it deliberate and, threatening? Perhaps not. But throughout the process, working on reporting on the FHSAA was harder, and they made it harder for me and clearly did not appreciate, my presence or or my reporting. But that's part of what we do as journalists, right? We go places people don't want us to be.
Absolutely. I do think it might not have been threatening. It was certainly trying to intimidate. And when reporters hear this, I want them to be able to recognize that this is what people do when they don't want reporters asking questions. Mm-hmm. And we just need to push on.
Yeah. I will also add to that, just because I think it's helpful for reporters to know. We were nervous that they weren't going to let me in to that meeting. Even though it's a public meeting, we were nervous that they would lock the door and not allow me in for some reason because they knew I was planning to come. And so we worked with our general counsel at the newspaper. They were like ready for my call in case they I believe drafted a letter that they could have sent me at a moment's notice to, kind of remind the FHSAA that they are a public body and that media is allowed. I didn't have any issues accessing the meeting, but if I would have driven 4 hours away and then they would have locked me out on a Sunday, if you're not prepared for that type of thing, it can really derail your reporting. So
absolutely. Yeah. So before we get to what happened at the meeting, I wanted to ask you, how was what was happening in Florida different from the rest of the country?
Actually, what I learned is that it wasn't that different from what was happening in the rest of the country. So there is a national physical form that was adopted by the American Academy of Pediatrics and developed through the course of reviews with several different boards of physicians, that was kind of distributed across the country saying, this is what you should use to register your athletes. These are the questions you should ask. And this is how you should do this form. And that form included the menstrual questions. Notably, in Florida, those questions were optional. On the national form, they were mandatory. And that was like, oh, okay, well, then this is happening across the country. Except for the fact that the national form was written in a way that explicitly told athletes, you should not be turning in your medical history to your schools. There was this big red box at the top that said, the only sheet that you need to share with, that you should share with your schools is the doctor sign off saying, yes, Katie can play track and field. She can run track and field. And
so this is the two-part form we were talking about earlier.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
So although those questions were mandatory for athletes to fill out and talk to their doctors about, all of that stayed with their physician. And so what I learned, what was different in Florida, is that the questions were optional. They were also being collected online, and also all of the medical history, including the menstrual history, was being collected. And later in the reporting process, I'm sure we'll get to this too, is 35 states until February, 35 states were asking these questions. And it's a total hodgepodge. It's not like every state in the country was using the national form and Florida was using its own. There are dozens of states that are using the national form, and some states who are using the national form but requiring athletes to turn in all the pages. So every state could kind of make its own decision on this. And even some major city school districts have separate athletic forms, but there's no standardized approach. And it ended up being that 35 states were asking these questions and having their students turn them in.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I loved was looking at a screenshot of your spreadsheet with every state and a link to their form and comments, and that was really organized.
Okay, I have to say, I made that in like a blinding moment of rage. And the reason why is because when the executive director of the FHSAA said that 49 states ask these menstrual questions, I recorded, I voice recorded the meeting so that I could look back on it. And you can hear me going, no, they don't. No, they don't. They don't do that. Because I had all the data. I'd gone through every single form. And so I had them all kind of linked in this other document, and I was like, I got to make a spreadsheet about this. But I was just typing so fast. It was just one of those moments where you're like, this is wrong information. Right. I know this because I've personally reviewed every one of these. This is wrong. So anyway, a note on that. Go ahead.
I was going to say, no, that is such a reporter moment. No, when you're like, no, and then you don't, you can't shout it out.
There were a couple of national reporters who asked me for a recording of the meeting. Mm-hmm. And I was like, if I send them the recording, they're going to hear me.
Your side commentary.
No, So that is the struggle when you're recording your own meeting is you get your own little comments in there, and it may have helped, though. It may have informed some of the reporting. I don't know.
So basically, the Athletic Association voted to keep the questions at that meeting. Then there was a petition signed by hundreds of people, but they stood by their decision. Then they reversed their decision in a special vote. And then Congress weighed in and announced legislation that would prohibit schools that receive federal funding from collecting data about students' menstrual history.
That is true. And wow, when you say it like that, I think about all of the ways that this story just changed course completely. The board of directors, which doesn't have many physicians on it, I think there might only be one person who is a doctor. They sent this to an entire committee made of physicians, and that physician committee and athletic trainers, I should say, they're not all MDs. That committee then kind of went in the opposite direction and said, no, we think that these questions should be mandatory. And that was just this moment where I was like, is my reporting actually making things worse? I mean, if you are someone who doesn't want to answer these questions and you want reproductive privacy, me calling attention to this has actually kind of backtracked what the
because it was optional,
right? Yeah. And then this moment in February happened where, there was this meeting that had taken place, and they had said, yep, we're going to recommend to the board of directors that these questions are mandatory. And then the board of directors called a special meeting to say, nope, we're going to reverse that. And we're actually going to take them off the form. So yeah, it really was a lot of twists and turns. And I have some records requests in right now to try and figure out what happened and why they source on that. So we'll report back.
I bet you do. Well, I wanted to ask you how you kept track of notes, like the spreadsheet we talked about, but this was like a great example of continuing coverage of a news story, right? Like you were always a step ahead. What tips do you have for journalists about how to do that?
This is a really important part of reporting. And sometimes I actually feel like I'm a better organizer than I am a reporter. And then my editor is like, no, that's not true. But I am meticulously organized on things like this. And I knew I had to be from the start as soon as we realized how big of a story this was going to be. And so I use Google Docs. I have my folder and subfolders. But when it got to the point where I was tracking all of the other athletic forums, even spreadsheets that only saw the light of the day because I tweeted them, spreadsheets to just follow my information requests. I was putting in FOIAs, I was putting in just even requests for information, not even records, and I had to track them and I had to follow up on them. And so I have a lot of internal spreadsheets that I use to kind of like organize my reporting. I have notebooks where I just took these little notes quickly as Holly and I were talking about the story. And I had to digitize those because I have to have this like running notes document of like, okay, I need to check on this. Okay, I need to follow up on that records request. So using the technology that we have and creating all of these places so you can just dump the information out so it doesn't have to stick in your brain, that has been very helpful for me. And organization is just really key on these. At one point, I had collected all of the FHSAA participation documents going back to 2002 because they only had back to 2002 available digitally. So I have 21 versions of the same form that all have to be labeled, and I have to know where all of them are.
Right.
What I also will just throw out there is that even if you don't start organized, like I just had this one random email from a tipster. I ended up having to download that email and keeping it. You don't have to be organized from the beginning. Like when you realize a story is big, then you can kind of take a moment to be like, okay, I'm making the Google folder. I'm making the Google Doc, because this story just changed so many times that I had to kind of track all of the changes. And now I have 55 folders and subfolders, even like when things started changing in February, I had this whole February folder because some of it was just new. So no, organization is key. And I tend to go on the digital route, but everyone should have a system that works best for them. I get it.
This story captured the national imagination. And I remember Katie seeing a ton of news articles about it from outlets all over the country. And you wrote a very interesting Twitter thread about national outlets who had jumped on the story. Tell me a little bit about that experience.
Okay, I'm going to tell you about it. And I hope that I remember this decision-making moment. And I hope that if anyone listens to this, that they choose the right path, because that Twitter thread came from a moment where I was reading a national outlet that literally word for word took my work. I was reading words that I and Holly had put together to get, when you're reading your thoughts on someone else's website.
And you know when you thought it.
And you know when you thought it, exactly. Or you know that you spent hours trying to figure out if that was the right word or that, And so I was in this kind of moment where I was really frustrated. And I think national outlets picking up local work is really important. Like we should always build on local reporters.
And that's a way to amplify as well.
Yes, 100%. And I think it's what ended up landing this in Congress. However, I had this moment where I was reading this report and I was so frustrated. And I had typed out a tweet that was kind of snarky, kind of calling out national reporters. I was in the newsroom, which we work from home and in the newsroom. And I looked at my colleague and I was like, tell me not to send this nasty tweet. It wasn't really nasty. It was just snarky, And she was like, oh, I think you should do it. And I was like, no. But I remember this decision-making process because I was like, okay, I could send out this kind of snarky tweet that will make me satisfied for half a moment, but it will really do nothing to amplify all of the work that Holly and me and my newsroom have put into the story.
Right.
So I scrapped it. It's still in my drafts. I'm never going to send it, but I scrapped it. And instead I was like, okay, I'm actually going to take another approach here. And I'm just going to detail every way that local reporting made the story what it was. I talked about driving 275 miles to the meeting. I talked about having to introduce myself. I shared photos that we didn't even use in the story of that letter that they sent out about how I'm not a doctor. I mean, so I had all this other stuff that, maybe wouldn't be appropriate in a story. And I wanted to share that without the buy-in of my editor and my executive editor, there's no chance that this story would have become what it was. And I'm really glad I did it. I'm really glad I didn't send the snarky tweet. I ended up making a document with all of the links to my reporting so that if anyone is reading my work, they can link to it, hopefully. And more of them did. More national outlets did after that, which was awesome. I was walking my dog and I heard Sarah McCanman's story on NPR, and she said the Palm Beach Post in the first two sentences. And I was like, oh my gosh, this work is on All Things Considered, because there's a right way and a wrong way to build on local reporting. And that was the right way. So I wanted to kind of share all of the ways that this story had kind of taken turns, all of the ways that we bought into it when we committed to reporting it, and all of the ways that it was made difficult for me to report it. And I'm really glad that thread took off the way that it did, because I think people really responded well to it and said, yeah, local reporting is really important.
I'm so glad I wasn't on Twitter when I was a local reporter, Kati, because I feel yes, there were a lot of tweets I would have had to delete. But I really try to keep it
positive too. I mean, it's not worth it. It's not, we're all trying to do the same job more or less, and tearing down other reporters, even if they do something that you disagree with, it's just, it's never going to be as insightful or helpful as what I think the positive tweets that we can put out there about our work do. So that's my 2 cents on that.
I agree. And I think this is a plug for national reporters, and I cover stuff nationally now. But I remember what it was like to see my work picked up without credit, and it sucks.
Yeah. No better word for it than that.
So I got to know you kind of online. We'd never met, through your tweets supporting journalists who had been laid off originally, I guess, by Gannett. And you and your colleagues created a spreadsheet to help. And you were relentless, and you still are, about this issue.
When this effort started, it was kind of rooted in this idea of mutual aid, which I think kind of really, it's always been prevalent in the US, but it really took off during the pandemic. And so our idea was, let's talk to the people who are laid off and ask them what they need. Do they want help finding new insurance? Do they want help, setting up childcare? Do they need housing? Do they need moral support? And the big things that kind of came out of our sampling of the people who reported their layoffs and what they needed is that they wanted professional networking help finding a new job, and moral support. And so each one of our teams, I kind of led this group of people, and everybody picked a team that they wanted to be on, and each team took a need. So I handled the financial needs with a couple of other people, and then we had a moral support team, and they ended up doing a letter writing network. So all the people who said yeah, I want to help, I want to provide moral support, they signed up to write letters, and with a $5 Starbucks gift card or like a Dunkin' gift card and just send people like notes of encouragement and letters talking about, anything really to kind of get them through the time after a layoff. And so that was really, really cool to see. And people ended up getting like 5 or 6 letters each, which was so great. We did a job fair. We did a professional networking database where if I'm looking for someone who works at, Politico, I can go in the network, the database, and just look up, and if they volunteered to network, then I can reach out to them. And we obviously did emergency financial assistance, which was just direct payments from us to them, where we gathered donations, and then we had this online accountability so that people could see that their donations were going to people. It was great. It was really kind of thrown together as the layoff news was coming out, but we then replicated the effort in December because Gannett laid off 250 more people.
Mm-hmm. It led me to do an episode and a webinar on journalists being laid off. What are some of the issues they need to think about? And I had been laid off, and it didn't occur to me to kind of do something that would kind of concretize what I had gone through. So thank you very much. And this is a plug for the episode if anyone wants to listen to it, because I think it really is as relevant today as when I did it last year.
We still share it. We still share it with everyone who fills out our form too, because this is part of our industry, and it's a terrible part of our industry. But I think I learned through that people still feel a lot of shame when it comes to layoffs. And if we can, provide community aid and provide letter writing and financial assistance and help finding childcare or a new place to live, people have to know that we're not alone. So many people in our industry have been through this, so it seems only right that we help.
We've been talking with Katherine Kokal, a journalist at the Palm Beach Post. You can follow her on Twitter at Kati Kokal. That's KATIKOKAL at Kati Kokal. Really, you should. Even the Hollywood star John Cena does. What was that like, by the way?
I wasn't special. He followed like tons of local journalists, all in one fell swoop. I thought I was special, and then I learned he followed everybody else. So I made a joke about it, and everybody, everyone learned they weren't special either, I guess.
Well, he doesn't follow me, but I would love him to follow at Ed Writers, the EWA account.
I'll put in a word.
That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kapita Cardoza. Do you have any questions for Kati? Let's continue this conversation on Twitter at EdWriters. And if you have any stories about student athletes in your state or district, please share them. #TellEWA. Special thanks to Angelina Liu and Kristan Obang from EWA and Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and to improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism.